So I've been reflecting, it's been 10 years that I've been writing about these topics, science and technology for Wired and The Atlantic and other places. And I don't think there's any single realm where we've seen more change or more interesting things happening than in mobility. Not just on the high-tech side in terms of autonomous vehicles, but also on the low-tech side, just the way that we've seen bike lanes and other things take off across our cities. And just the cultural change that's been associated with that. I was riding in from Dulles, unfortunately, yesterday, and was talking to the driver about his kids, none of whom have a license, and they're 17, 19, and 22. I don't know about you, but I got a license when I turned 16. And that's a tremendous, tremendous cultural as well as technological change. Let's go far future. We saw the data in the room, I hope. Let's go 20 years out. How do you think you specifically would have gotten to this event? And let's just go down the line.
Great. Thanks for hosting us today, Alexis. I sincerely hope I will still be bicycling in as I rode in today, and enjoying a much safer environment where cycling feels totally safe, and I could be cycling with my kids or with my parents or anyone of any age. And that's my hope for the future, that I think autonomous vehicles can be part of and can support that future by creating a safer street environment in our cities.
Right, so I came in through the metro today, but I guess in the future, I'd probably be coming in an automated vehicle, and depending on how late I am, maybe representing myself via WebEx in my car, autonomously driving here while engaging in a conversation.
So I live out past Dulles, so that's my commute all the time. So people ask me how I do that right now, which is I do a self-calculation of what's my fastest combination of transportation. Is it myself to metro to come in and then Uber? What combination makes sense? So in the future, though, I think that I'll be, my schedule will be on my calendar. It'll tell me ahead of time what time I need to leave, and then it'll be mapped out for me. It'll tell me the fastest way to get in for the cost that I want to spend.
Right, like I've always wanted that on Waze or Google Maps or something, just like get me there as fast as possible and let me fill in the modes.
Yep.
How far away do you think we are from that in terms, and what are the kind of stumbling blocks?
So for that technology, I don't think we're that far away. It's a matter of it's connecting the systems of data that exist disparately now. But in terms of then looking at new modes and new ways of doing it, greater rideshare is going to continue to move out towards the suburbs. It's more prevalent here, close in, but I'll be able to do that more easily. And that is cultural acceptance, and it's a matter of density of people doing it. And then the autonomous vehicles, once we get in closer to the city, I think is what we'll see.
Linda, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, we're going to talk about technology in a second, but what are the key things, like 2 or 3 things that cities should or could do to make the autonomous vehicle system work better?
I think there's a couple of things, principles we know now. There's a lot we don't know about technology. I say sometimes the technology question is a Rorschach test, like how do you see your future? What's your fantasy version? And I think from a city perspective, like I work with city transportation agencies. They're very practical people. They're trying to figure out how to fill in the potholes tomorrow. And by the way, potholes are a big issue for autonomous vehicles. Believe it or not, still very fundamental issues. In any case, I think that cities, though, really need to be working with private partners to build a concrete data sharing platform, and we're doing some work on that right now with an open transport partnership to create a safe way to share completely anonymized data and have everybody looking at the same information as we see how these technologies are developing, how they're being used by consumers, and how they're influencing the way our cities function overall. And that's really critical, and data always makes people fall asleep, but it's really important, I promise.
Is that just trip data? Or is that something more? Is that the LiDAR data that sort of models our cities? Like, what are you thinking in terms of what data would be?
We're starting with the things we know we can get right now, and then I think the question is, what do we start to see as necessary as we go forward? I think the one thing that I always hear, we've been talking a lot, actually with Uber, the sponsor of this event, about data sharing, and one of the concerns is that the public sector just wants everything. We just want it all. Like, give me all your information about every single thing, and we'll decide what we're going to do with it later. That's not really a sustainable model for the private sector. sector, and we totally get that in the public sector. So one of the things we're trying to do right now is be practical and say, like, here are the things we might do. Like, we might, improve a street in a certain way. We might narrow the travel lanes so we can put in a bike lane so that autonomous vehicles can get around cyclists without having to negotiate a more human type interaction, things like that. So we kind of need to know these kind of things about your operation so that we know when that's necessary, right, or when that's a good idea. So we're trying to pair those policy ideas that cities are already coming up with the kind of data we would need to know to steer them. So we're not trying to just grab everything. We're trying to be targeted. LiDAR data seems like it would be great. Maybe someday, I don't know. Right now, we're thinking much more concrete things like traffic flows, safety data, and equity, which is a big topic in our cities right now.
Reginald, why don't we talk about the sort of local technological situation here? I come from the Bay. You see self-driving cars in the parking lot at coffee shops. What's it like here in Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., and is there anything special or specific that's happening here that's not happening elsewhere?
Right, so one thing we have here in the Northern Virginia region is actually off of the interstates. We've worked in partnership with Virginia Department of Transportation, Transurban, to name a few in here, for example, that we have a Virginia automated corridors in which we actually have a real-world test world environment in which we could test automated vehicles. In addition, we have also a Virginia connected corridors in which we have dedicated short-range communications, which is a basic safety message that's transmitted from vehicles out into the infrastructure for other vehicles to basically communicate with each other. So one part about the basic safety message, it includes lots of very important information regarding locations of vehicle, kinematics and so forth. So with that information, you could essentially detect certain crashes or certain events that are going on roadways. Like she was mentioning before, as far as potholes or different things in the roadway, every individual vehicle could essentially be some sort of probe, some sort of crowdsourced piece of information infrastructure that could go up into the cloud or into some infrastructure that people could utilize. So you could detect things like potholes, or even using radar, for example, to detect how many cars are in the roadway, or using cameras, for example. So it'd be up to the vehicle, at least I think, to kind of detect these objects and basically spin it up to infrastructure in a certain way.
And do you find that the different companies have a different approach to working with that kind of city infrastructure? I mean, when I would talk with Google in the early days of their self-driving car program, they would talk about how they wanted the first Google car that was on the road to be as capable as the 1,000, no matter sort of where they were deployed. Do you find that there are other, are the car makers more amenable to that kind of embed infrastructure into the city kind of model?
Right, so we work in partnership with a lot of the car manufacturers, actually a consortium of them that work together to kind of have this standardized communication protocol. So they're all speaking the same exact language. So at least we're there, that part, where all the various car manufacturers could speak that. As far as sharing with each other, that's one thing. They're in a cooperative environment, but when it's all said and done, so they're still car manufacturers, and they're still going to go their particular way as far as what's their competitive advantage.
Michelle, I know from my prep packet that you are also interested in goods movement, in cargo.
Yes.
And one of the things that it's very dear to my heart, I did a whole big project on container shipping and logistics. How does the sort of cargo side of this play into the transportation of people side too?
Well, part of it's really on our interstates, I think, too, in terms of that's where we'll see the greatest interaction between, I think, still a lot of the self-driven cars but then the automated freight movement that needs to take place on those interstates. And it also helps to look at the congestion. When you've got some of the other movement of freight on the highways using trucks that can platoon, they take up a lot less space.
So what would explain what platooning is for people?
So platooning is, well, there's a couple different variations of it. One is just purely to get greater efficiency of the lead truck, creating draft for the trucks behind it so that there's greater fuel efficiency. But then what we can evolve to is an automated vehicle where it's the first one that's really steering the train of trucks that are going down the highway.
So it's basically a human driving the first truck, and then there's a bunch of trucks following it.
Just following behind, yeah.
So like a train without tracks.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually have to put in less infrastructure to have that same sort of volume of movement than we do with the trains.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I've heard in that realm is sort of that it's hard, it's probably easy to automate driving on highways for trucks.
Right.
But it's sort of hard to automate the job of truck driver.
Yes.
And so you end up with this sort of port model almost where you've got automated trucks on the highways who pull
Off
into
and on.
some sort of land port where a bunch of drivers are kind of there waiting to take it the last mile.
And it's not that different from the movement of people, too. It's about, like, how do we move people the longer distances quickly with the most effective technology, which could be automated, which can be like the platooning, but then you look at the people movement, too. But then as you get off, it starts becoming much more personalized. Where does that freight need to go? Where does that person need to go? Some sort of networking.
Let's talk about other technologies. I mean, we could easily take up the whole session just talking about autonomous vehicles. So let's talk about other technologies or planning ideas. Doesn't necessarily have to be a technology that you're most excited about. Just one or two from each of you.
Well, I think it's a really interesting. Some of the technology that's already available today that is changing the way we use transportation is the TNC, or the Transportation Network Company technology that Uber and Lyft and other similar companies are using. And I think it's really interesting because it's showing us a different price point for travel. Like right now, or let's say prior to that, yes, in some markets they're really great taxi service, which was already providing some of those other price points. But generally speaking, I'd say Uber and Lyft fall somewhere in between the taxi cab, like maybe a personal vehicle, taxi cab, and transit. They're somewhere in between. So I think we're starting to understand a little bit more about the economics of how people perceive travel and what kind of things that they want in the consumer market. I think it's really interesting. I think one of our great failings in transportation planning, and I'm a planner, is that we don't think about economics very much. We think it's like a like I love when the engineers tell me it's like plumbing. It's just like plumbing. You flush your toilet, you want it to go away. It's just like, it's not how I think of my life. So, in getting around the city. So let's think about it more in a nicer way. But it is an economic question, and so I think just starting to understand those different ways of perceiving how we travel and how that'll influence things in the future. I don't think we know a lot about the future AVs in certain ways, but I think the general consensus is that the costs will go down, let's say, from the price of owning your own car. That's kind of generally the consensus. So that is important to start understanding. How does that influence the way people travel? Do they travel more? Do they travel less? Do they travel more efficiently? Do they, take advantage of the fact that there's no need to park? Those kind of aspects I think are really important to start thinking about.
Does anyone else want to chime in on parking? I feel like that is one of the topics that is kind of most important in this realm. If you didn't have to have the same kind of parking requirements, how much space does that open up within all kinds of urban environments?
Well, one way to talk about parking right now is just the continued investment that's going into it. So to your point, yes, it can open up space in the urban centers, but if you even think of the large airports and some of the major projects that are going on, some of it's to build large rental car facilities, parking facilities still continues to be a big part of their planning. Well, how do they need to do that now? Because we still need it at this moment, but how do they start planning now, having flexible facilities so that those can be used differently in the future, whether that's the place, let's say the airports, if that's the place where the electric vehicles, self-driving, go out and do their recharging at night and are stationed to then come back in. So we need to start thinking now about where are these likely to go and how do we not create more hard infrastructure that we then have to decommission later or retrofit later more expensively.
Reginald, why don't we talk about your technologies that you're excited about?
So I think electrification of vehicles is a pretty important thing as far as it goes hand in hand almost with automated vehicles. I guess to touch on your point as well as far as economics is concerned.
Why is that? Why does it go hand in hand with automated vehicles?
It just seems like it's the easier control system, one. Then you have disruptors like Tesla coming into the market, easily dropping in. They don't have to create a new combustion engine. They have very straightforward technologies where they include a battery pack and motors to the wheels. So it's an easier, I guess, hurdle for them to overcome, in which they did. So the reason about electrification too, and I think to speak about the infrastructure aspect and the cost, is the gas tax, because that basically funds a lot of the infrastructure. How's that going to change with electric vehicles, and how we're going to utilize that to pay for certain types of things? And kind of one crazy idea I had as far as electrification of vehicles are concerned, what if there's always that thought of automated vehicles just driving around like drones waiting to get picked up the next thing? Why can't they jump into a parking lot, for example, or like an empty flatbed parking lot? Maybe even have some solar roofs on top, and they connect themselves to the grid. So now these vehicles turn into basically a huge solar field, providing energy back into the local grid in a certain location. So that's a positive green spin on things I like.
Well, and to the economics point that Linda made, actually, if you look at the combination of greater ride sharing, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles, those three things together are what's going to bring down the economics of transportation of that individual and the decision point that they're making, because electric vehicles right now aren't the most cost-effective thing for an individual to own because they don't get enough drive time in it to make it worth to have the return on that investment. But then when you add that ride sharing to that starts bringing down the price point because it's actually being used more. And then when you add in there the autonomous vehicle, now you don't have to have a driver associated with it. You've now taken another cost out of the system. So those three trends together are going to make the difference it's going to create a tipping point and bring the transition much faster in certain areas.
Linda and Michelle, you could talk about models for cities that are doing this planning in an interesting way, or regions or areas that are putting in big capital projects that make sense for this era that we're talking about.
That's a good question. I have to say, I think almost all of my cities are thinking about this. We have 55 member city agencies that work in this area, as well as doing things like filling potholes. I do think some of the leaders in it are Los Angeles, and Sleeta Reynolds, I know, is going to speak a little later today from the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. New York City has been pushing on a lot of the technology sides, on the city side, and also on the street design that can transfer quickly and easily to a more autonomous model. And also, I know Seattle's been working on some things. I hate to not only mention three of my members. So, I do think everybody is doing a lot of good work. But I know that those are some that have been out in front and really pushing the envelope on, new ideas like, let's try having a city-owned fleet of electric vehicles that's shared in a low-income neighborhood. Let's see how it goes, And that's just really exciting, and I hope that Sleeta talks a little bit about that later.
I think there's a lot of testing going on, in that. Like, how do we put this into our planning? Because you do see things where Pittsburgh is trying different things, and Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, and everybody is still testing out, which I think is good. And because we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, and so let's see what the model is. But the more that we can have the private and public sector working these things together, the better. And you mentioned the gas tax. One of the other things that we have to pay attention to in all of this in the planning, one of the most important things cities and others can pay attention to is the maintenance side of things. We were talking about this earlier. That car out there is very dependent on lines being on the road, signage being what you'd expect, being able to read lights. And so the basic maintenance of our road system is a critical factor in this. So how are we going to pay for that? Well, actually, as it turns into more of a business of moving people, you can build that cost of movement and the cost of maintaining the infrastructure into that price point much more easily than sending me my bill for the vehicle miles driven from my car. So.
Let's take some questions from the crowd. I think there's a couple of mics out there. Oh, there we go.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mara Brophy. I work on transportation and infrastructure projects for the Federal City Council. My question is about the land use connection. We've talked about parking this morning. I've also been hearing and reading a lot about the ways in which changes in mobility might affect the retail landscape. I'm just curious about your thoughts on how changes in mobility might affect the built environment.
I can take a couple stabs at that. I think the two areas are parking. Specifically, we devote a lot of space in our cities to parking, both surface lots, depending on the city, and structured parking, which is very expensive to build and to maintain. And it increases the cost of development in many cities as well, that requirements for a certain number of parking spots per unit, et cetera. So there's a huge hope on the land use side that I've heard a lot about from my kind of colleagues that work more on the land use. They're really hoping that they can reduce the costs of development and frankly put more of the things we want in our cities, pack it into the same space. The other thing I will mention is I think that we're hoping we can make our city streets a more pleasant place to be, and that will support retail and on-street retail, and that has to do with creating a more reliable travel environment that kind of sticks to its lane. A computer, people get impatient, computers don't, so having something that really supports a really great, vibrant city is a part of the way we think about how we're developing.
Do any of you think that this suite of technology is actually going to re-empty the cities? Like, we've had this great movement to bring people back in but you make the commute easier. You make the commute basically like playing on your phone for an hour. Does that seem plausible? I mean, it's certainly something that I have heard.
Again, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Go ahead.
You can think about your answer. Like, I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is that when you lower the cost of travel, and hopefully lower the cost of development, what you really find out is where do people really want to live, you know, like where does the market go up, where does it go down? There's a famous case from, I think, 15 years ago now, but in Spain, part of the reasoning behind their their high-speed rail network was to improve the development outside of Madrid, because Spain is typically very centered on Madrid in terms of the economy. And what they found instead was that people who had to do business out in Sevilla and other like outlying towns found it even easier to live in Madrid and just go out for business trips. So I think part of what it does is it reveals where people really want to live. And that's why I think when cities work on this stuff, we have to not think too much about the method. Remember, transportation is a method to get something you really want. So, and think instead about what we want to be as cities and make sure our transportation systems support that.
I've got a question here. Oh, and also here.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. What do we still need to know about how autonomous vehicles interact with pedestrians? What research do we need to do?
Right, so down in Virginia Tech, down in Blacksburg, we have a Smart Road, which is a private, basically test track at 2.2 miles, created back in 2002, or 2000, but it allows for us to test certain fringe cases where automated vehicles don't work too well. So we have a controlled experimental test where we expose these vehicles and algorithms, essentially, to these type of environments and different use cases of crossing traffic and so forth. So we're still working with some of the manufacturers and car people to work on those type of things. It's getting close, but I think within the next 5 to 10 years, really, you'll see that problem solved.
It's interesting, though. I mean, I think if you talk to the companies, they would say there's plenty of what they would call, edge cases that are really hard to build in to the core of the way that their things function. I mean, Google kind of famously shared at one point that one of their cars encountered someone in a wheelchair with a broom chasing like a wild turkey down the road. And they were just sort of like, hadn't thought about that one. And then they have to, make whatever changes they make, and then rerun it against all the previous data that they had, all the other previous encounters, to make sure they don't break anything. And so I think one of the things that we've seen with, at least that self-driving program is like they got really quickly to like putting cars out there, being on the highway, all those things. But it's, the last percent is going to take quite a while to find those edge cases. I had one here first, if I can.
Good morning. My name's Amy Conrick with the Community Transportation Association based here in DC. I have 2 questions I'll throw out very quickly. One question is, you talked a lot about the technology. How do you see customer behavior changing? Is it keeping pace? Is it lagging behind? And if it's lagging, what can we do to change it? And the second question is, how do we take a lot of these technological developments and apply them to more of a suburban or rural kind of setting? Thank you.
Well, I think you're going to see different uptake and different, as you're even bringing out the difference between suburban and rural and dense urban city, but even if you look at the differences in what the income level is in that dense urban area is going to change the way that the combination of these technologies come together. But you're going to see change in all of those, in all of those environments. And that's where I get back to, I want that app that will tell me what's the best way for me to get where I want to go from where I'm going based on my preferences. Whether it's a cost preference or a time preference, or, I get to see things along the way and I get to relax along the way. I like to share or I don't like to share. It's to have those systems that allow that to act seamlessly from wherever I'm coming, that I think will allow the uptake in the consumer behavior to be taken into account. But it's not going to be a common system that you'll see in every city or every suburban area.
I'm also a little bit worried, actually, that you do, in fact, end up with this system where people in cities have access to a whole packet of technologies that allow them to move in different ways, and people stuck in the hinterlands don't have access to any of those things because it doesn't make economic sense to run lifts 30 miles outside the city, or run Ubers, or run any, ride hailing or autonomous vehicle service in the future. That does actually kind of, I think it's something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm James Trout. I'm a disability rights advocate and I'm majoring in getting my master's degree in transportation policy operations and logistics at George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia. And my question for you is as follows. Our population is aging and increasingly, and the population of people with disabilities is growing. It's at 57 million right now, and it's only going to grow as our population ages. What new technologies do the four of you see that are disability friendly? Do you see being integrated into our system? Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Who wants to take that?
Well, I can tell you what I do right now, which, so I care for my, not in my home, but I'm responsible for caring for my mom, who's elderly. And I can't always be there to take her where she wants to go, but I can make sure that the right transportation gets to her and takes her there. It's not easy, though. It's still not easy. I can't necessarily make sure the right type of vehicle that will accommodate her will show up. So again, it's the information, it's the personalizing that to the situation of that individual to get them there. But I think it's only going to increase the mobility of those who are older and those with disability. It will actually give them greater freedom and greater mobility, but we have to allow the system to give the information so you can get that to that individual. And we're seeing that even right now in the transit systems with paratransit, being able to take advantage of the ride-sharing capability of an Uber to make sure that individuals are cared for and can get where they need to go without having to have expensive bus routes that maybe go just the right way with the equipment built in, but personalize it to them.
I think, unfortunately, we are out of time. I wanted everyone to join me in thanking our panelists. And you guys will follow me out. Thank you very much.